The arrival at Gate 14. The airport buzzed with its usual rhythm, a symphony of boarding calls, footsteps echoing across the tiled floors, and the hum of conversations blending into the backdrop. Families hurried toward gates, travelers sipped coffee, and business professionals scrolled through emails while waiting to board. Among them was Evelyn Carter, a woman whose presence turned heads without her uttering a single word. Evelyn, tall and statuesque, radiated grace. Her caramel complexion gleamed under the airport's fluorescent lights. Her rich auburn curls swept neatly into a low bun. She wore a burgundy blazer over a cream blouse, tailored trousers that accentuated her slender frame, and a pair of polished loafers that clicked softly as she walked. A vintage leather bag hung from her shoulder, complementing her effortless sophistication. Around her neck, a gold pendant glimmered, a gift from her husband, Marcus, who always said it symbolized her strength. As Evelyn approached Gate 14, her sharp eyes scanned the boarding area. She was used to traveling, navigating the chaos of airports with ease. Her husband often joked that she seemed more at home in an airport lounge than their own living room. But today, Evelyn felt a twinge of unease. She couldn't pinpoint the cause. The lingering intuition whispered that something was off. Evelyn reached the counter and presented her boarding pass with a polite smile. The gate agent, a young woman with a nervous demeanor, glanced briefly at the ticket before stiffening. Her gaze shifted to the pilot standing nearby. Captain Russell Hayes leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room with an air of self-importance. His salt and pepper hair and crisp uniform gave him an aura of authority, but the slight sneer on his lips betrayed arrogance. The gate agent hesitated. One moment, ma'am," she said, her voice faltering. Evelyn arched an eyebrow, but remained silent. She had encountered this hesitation before. The subtle pauses, the side glances, the unspoken questions. It was all too familiar. Captain Hayes stepped forward, his boots clicking against the floor. He looked Evelyn up and down, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," he began, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "Are you sure you're at the correct gate?" Evelyn's eyes met his, calm and steady. "Quite sure," she replied, her voice measured. Hayes chuckled, a sound that grated against the quiet tension building around them. "It's just unusual to see someone like you in first class." The words hung in the air like a thundercloud. Evelyn felt the weight of his implication, but refused to flinch. Around her, passengers began to take notice, their conversations fading into murmurs. She could feel their stares, a mix of curiosity and unease, but she held her ground. "Is there an issue with my ticket?" Evelyn asked, her tone sharp yet composed. Hayes smirked, his confidence unshaken. "I like to double-check certain passengers. For security reasons." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes narrowing. "I wasn't aware that pilots were responsible for ticket verification," she said, "or profiling passengers, for that matter." The murmurs grew louder. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. The gate agent looked trapped, her eyes darting between Evelyn and Hayes. "I'm just following protocol," Hayes said, his smirk widening. "We've had some incidents lately, and I take safety very seriously." "Safety," Evelyn repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What exactly about me poses a safety concern?" Hayes opened his mouth to reply but hesitated, his confidence faltering for a split second. Evelyn seized the moment, reaching into her bag for her phone. "I'll contact my husband," she said simply, dialing the number without waiting for a response. Hayes laughed, the sound dripping with mockery. "Oh, please. Do you really think a phone call will change anything? You're wasting your time." Evelyn ignored him, her fingers steady-ish. She held the phone to her ear. "Marcus," she said calmly when he answered. "I need you at Gate 14. Now." The quiet authority in her voice silenced the crowd further. Evelyn ended the call and slipped her phone back into her bag. She stepped aside from the counter, her posture unbroken. "I'll wait," she said, her words carrying an unshakable resolve. Passengers whispered behind cupped hands, their curiosity mounting. Evelyn stood motionless, her calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside her. She had faced situations like this before. Unspoken prejudice disguised as protocol, microaggressions cloaked in false civility. But today, she wouldn't let it slide. Today, she had someone in her corner who wouldn't tolerate it either. Minutes ticked by, each second amplifying the tension. Hayes leaned against the counter again, feigning indifference, but his smug expression betrayed a sense of triumph. He believed he had won. That belief was shattered when Marcus Carter entered the scene. Marcus moved through the terminal with an air of quiet authority that commanded attention. Standing over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders and chiseled features gave him a commanding presence. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, he exuded confidence and power. As he approached the gate, passengers instinctively stepped aside, sensing that he was not a man to be trifled with. His eyes locked onto Evelyn, who stood as poised as ever, though he could see the tension in her jaw. His expression softened briefly before hardening again as he turned his gaze to Hayes. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Hayes straightened, his arrogance faltering for the first time. "Sir, I was just ensuring the safety of my passengers," he said, his tone suddenly defensive. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly about my wife makes her a safety concern?" The gate fell silent. Every pair of eyes was now fixed on a confrontation unfolding before them. Evelyn remained composed, her faith in Marcus unwavering. "Sir, I don't have to justify my actions to you," Hayes said, his bravado returning. Marcus stepped closer, his towering frame forcing Hayes to lean back slightly. "You do now," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "Because I am Marcus Carter, owner of this airline. And you, Captain Hayes, have just made the biggest mistake of your career." The unfolding consequences. The atmosphere around Gate 14 shifted the moment Marcus Carter revealed his identity. His words echoed through the terminal like the toll of a bell, silencing even the quiet murmurs of the passengers. Captain Hayes froze, his confident smirk melting into a strained, pale expression. It was clear that he hadn't anticipated this turn of events. Marcus turned to Evelyn, his expression softening for a fleeting moment. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentler now, but still loud enough to remind everyone who he was and what he stood for. Evelyn gave a small nod, her calm exterior unwavering. "I'm fine," she replied, though her eyes betrayed the simmering frustration she had held back. "But I'm not the one who needs an explanation." Marcus's face hardened again as he turned his attention back to Hayes. "Let me make something very clear," he began, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of unshakable authority. "This airline prides itself on its values. Values that you've chosen to disregard with your behavior today." Hayes opened his mouth, likely to sputter out some justification, but Marcus silenced him with a raised hand. "I'm not finished," Marcus said firmly. The passengers at the gate leaned in, their anticipation palpable. Some recorded the confrontation on their phones, their cameras capturing every tense second. The gate agent, caught in the crossfire, looked like she wanted to disappear. Marcus glanced briefly in her direction before speaking again. "Did she present a valid ticket?" he asked, his tone pointed. "Yes, sir," the gate agent stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then what exactly is the issue?" Marcus demanded, his gaze snapping back to Hayes. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot less like protocol and a lot more like prejudice." Hayes tried to regain his composure, straightening his shoulders and clearing his throat. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, I was acting with the passengers' best interests in mind, given recent security concerns." "Stop," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through Hayes' excuse like a knife. "Do not insult me or my wife's intelligence by hiding behind vague references to security concerns. You and I both know what this is really about." The crowd murmured in agreement, their discomfort giving way to quiet indignation. A woman standing nearby, holding a toddler on her hip, whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Good for him. It's about time someone stood up to this kind of behavior." Marcus stepped closer to Hayes, his presence overwhelming. "Tell me, Captain Hayes," he said, his tone as cold as steel, "how many other passengers have you questioned today? Or was my wife the only one you singled out?" Hayes hesitated, his eyes darting toward the gate agent for support. When none came, he fumbled for words. I was just trying to." "You were just trying to assert your authority," Marcus interjected. "But you picked the wrong person. My wife is more than capable of standing up for herself, but I won't stand by while you attempt to humiliate her in front of all these people." Hayes's face flushed a deep red. "Sir, I didn't mean." Marcus held up a hand again. "I don't care what you meant," he said, his voice rising slightly. "What matters is what you did. You've embarrassed my wife, disrespected this company, and undermined the very principles we stand for. And now you're going to face the consequences." At that moment, a team of airport security officers arrived, summoned discreetly by the gate staff. The lead officer, a tall man with a calm yet commanding presence, approached Marcus. "Mr. Carter," he said, nodding respectfully, "we're here to assist." "Thank you," Marcus replied. He gestured toward Hayes. "This man is no longer fit to serve as a representative of this airline. Please escort him from this gate." Hayes's jaw dropped. "You can't do this," he protested, his voice tinged with desperation. "I've been with this airline for over 20 years. And that makes your behavior today even more disgraceful." Marcus shot back. "You should know better." The security officers stepped forward, their expressions neutral but firm. "Captain Hayes," one of them said, "please come with us." Hayes's protests grew louder as he was led away, his voice echoing down the terminal until it faded into the distance. The crowd watched in stunned silence, and then, as if on cue, a wave of applause broke out. It started small, just a few claps from a man in a business suit, but quickly grew into a resounding show of support. Marcus turned to Evelyn, his expression softening once more. "Let's get you boarded," he said. Evelyn smiled faintly, her composure still intact. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but filled with gratitude. Marcus turned back to the gate agent, who looked like she was trying to shrink into the floor. "Ensure that my wife is boarded first," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I expect her to be treated with the utmost respect." "Yes, sir," the gate agent replied hastily. She scanned Evelyn's boarding pass with trembling hands and gestured toward the jet bridge. Evelyn paused before stepping onto the bridge, her gaze sweeping across the passengers who had witnessed the ordeal. She could see the mixture of emotions in their faces: shock, admiration, and in some cases, guilt. She hoped the incident had planted a seed of awareness, a reminder that prejudice and discrimination had no place anywhere, least of all in the skies. As she walked down the jet bridge, Marcus stayed behind to address the gate staff and ensure that the situation was properly documented. His presence lingered like an unspoken promise. This wasn't over. Evelyn's experience would not be swept under the rug, and the airline would be better for it. For Evelyn, the ordeal had been draining, but it also reaffirmed something she had always known. Her worth was not up for debate, and neither was her right to exist in any space she chose to occupy. A ripple effect. As Evelyn settled into her seat in first class, the weight of the incident at Gate 14 still pressed against her, but she refused to let it consume her. Her seat was situated near the window, offering a view of the bustling tarmac below. The hum of the plane's engines reverberated through the cabin, mingling with the murmurs of other passengers. Evelyn took a deep breath, letting the familiar routine of air travel steady her thoughts. The flight attendants, clearly aware of what had unfolded at the gate, treated Evelyn with extra care. Their smiles warmer than usual, their voices softer. One of them, a young woman with a kind face and a name tag that read Leela, approached Evelyn shortly after she took her seat. "Mrs. Carter," Leila began hesitantly, clutching a tray with a glass of water. "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened back there. It was unacceptable, and we're all truly sorry." Evelyn glanced up at Leila, reading the sincerity in her expression. "Thank you," Evelyn said, her voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your kindness, but it's not you who needs to apologize. It's the system that allows people like that to act with impunity." Leila nodded, her cheeks flushing. "You're absolutely right. If there's anything you need during this flight, please don't hesitate to let me know." Evelyn offered a small smile. "Thank you, Leila." As the flight attendants continued preparing the cabin for departure, Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her mind replaying the events at the gate. Her husband's intervention had been swift and decisive, but she couldn't shake the nagging thought that this wasn't an isolated incident. How many others had faced similar treatment, without someone like Marcus to step in and demand justice? Evelyn's phone vibrated in her lap, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus, who had stayed behind to address the fallout of the incident before boarding another flight. His text was simple but reassuring. "Handled everything. We'll talk when you land. Love you." Evelyn smiled faintly, her chest tightening with gratitude for the man who had always stood by her side. Unwavering in his support, she typed a quick reply. "Love you too." Meanwhile, back in the terminal, Marcus Carter was far from finished. After ensuring Evelyn's boarding went smoothly, he had requested a meeting with the airport's management team. The airline had its own set of policies and standards, but Marcus knew that systemic issues like the one Evelyn faced often stemmed from broader institutional attitudes. He was determined to confront those attitudes head-on. In a private conference room near the airline's executive offices, Marcus sat across from two members of the airport's management team. The first, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a name badge that read Paul Reynolds, looked visibly uncomfortable. The second, a younger woman with sharp features and an air of confidence, introduced herself as Samantha Lee, the airport's operations manager. "Mr. Carter," Samantha began, her tone professional but cautious, "we want to start by apologizing for what happened to your wife. I assure you, this is not reflective of our airport's values." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unyielding. "With all due respect, Ms. Lee, I've heard those words too many times to take them at face value. What happened at Gate 14 is a symptom of a deeper problem, one that won't be solved with empty apologies." Paul shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Samantha's gaze remained steady. "You're absolutely right," she said, "but we can't address the issue unless we understand the full scope of what happened. Could you walk us through the incident from your perspective?" Marcus took a deep breath, recounting the events in detail: the gate agent's hesitation, Captain Hayes's condescension, and the blatant prejudice that had been thinly veiled as protocol. His tone was measured, but there was no mistaking the passion behind his words. "This wasn't just about my wife being delayed," Marcus said firmly. "It was about the message that behavior like Hayes's sends to everyone watching. It tells people of color that they don't belong in certain spaces, no matter how qualified or deserving they are. And that's unacceptable." Samantha nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I understand your frustration, and I agree that we need to take action. Captain Hayes's behavior will be addressed." "He's already been removed from his position," Marcus interjected. "But addressing one individual isn't enough. This is about changing the culture that allowed him to act the way he did in the first place." Paul finally spoke up, his voice tentative. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Carter?" "I'm suggesting that you start by acknowledging the problem," Marcus replied. "Not just in words, but in actions. Implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all airport staff, from the gate agents to the pilots. Establish clear protocols for handling incidents like this in the future. And most importantly, make sure those protocols are enforced." Paul looked overwhelmed, but Samantha nodded again, a determined glint in her eye. "Those are all actionable steps," she said, and I'll personally ensure they're brought to the attention of our board. This is an opportunity for us to do better, not just for your wife, but for everyone who comes through this airport." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before giving a small nod. "I'll hold you to that," he said. "And believe me, I'll be watching." Back on the flight, Evelyn's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another passenger in first class. A woman in her 40s with a kind smile and a stylish scarf took the seat across the aisle. She leaned over slightly, her expression curious yet warm. "Excuse me," the woman said. "I couldn't help but recognize you from the gate. You handled yourself with such grace back there. I just wanted to say, thank you." Evelyn looked at her, surprised. "Thank you." The woman nodded. "For standing your ground. For showing the rest of us what dignity looks like in the face of injustice. It's easy to turn a blind eye when we're not the ones being targeted, but you reminded all of us that silence is complicity." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat, but she managed to smile. "That means a lot," she said softly. "Thank you." The woman reached across the aisle, extending her hand. "My name's Claire, by the way." "Evelyn," she replied, shaking Claire's hand. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Evelyn felt a sense of clarity settle over her. The events at Gate 14 had been painful, but they had also sparked something greater, a ripple effect that would extend far beyond this flight. She knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a while, she felt a glimmer of hope. And as the plane lifted into the sky, Evelyn resolved to carry that hope with her, wherever her journey might lead. The echoes of justice. As the plane soared above the clouds, Evelyn found herself staring out the window, her thoughts tangled in a web of emotions. The adrenaline from the confrontation had subsided, leaving in its wake a blend of exhaustion and determination. She couldn't help but replay the events at the gate in her mind, dissecting every word, every look, every moment of tension. But she wasn't just reflecting on the injustice she had faced. She was thinking about what it meant to challenge prejudice in such a public way. She knew the incident at Gate 14 would ripple far beyond the terminal, impacting everyone who had witnessed it and possibly others who would hear about it. As she gazed at the clouds, her phone buzzed softly on the armrest beside her. The flight had Wi-Fi, and Evelyn had left her device connected, though she hadn't expected any messages. Picking it up, she saw an email from Marcus with the subject line, "Update on Hayes." Curious, Evelyn opened it. The email was short but to the point. Subject, "Update on Hayes." From Marcus Carter. "Evelyn, Hayes has been permanently dismissed, effective immediately. The airport management has agreed to initiate mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff. I also insisted on a formal public statement from the airline addressing what happened. It'll be released within the next 24 hours. This isn't just about today. It's about setting a precedent. You stood tall, and because of that, we're making real progress. Love, Marcus." Evelyn's lips curved into a small smile as she read the message. Marcus's ability to turn a moment of adversity into an opportunity for change was one of the reasons she admired him so deeply. He never allowed injustice to pass unchallenged, and his commitment to creating a better world was unshakable. But Evelyn also knew that the road ahead was still long. One incident addressed didn't mean the battle was over. She resolved to use her voice and her platform to amplify the lessons of today, ensuring that others wouldn't have to endure what she had. Meanwhile, back at the airport, the fallout from the incident was spreading like wildfire. Videos of the confrontation, recorded by passengers at Gate 14, had begun to circulate online. Within hours, hashtags like #JusticeAtGate14 and #CartervsPrejudice were trending across social media platforms. The footage showed Marcus confronting Hayes, his voice calm but firm as he demanded accountability. Passengers who had witnessed the exchange started sharing their accounts of what had happened, many of them praising Marcus and Evelyn for their grace under pressure. One tweet read, I was at Gate 14 today when I saw Evelyn Carter handle blatant discrimination with more dignity than most of us could muster. Her husband, Marcus, was a force of nature. This is what standing up to injustice looks like. #Justice at Gate 14. Another post, accompanied by a short video clip, said, Captain Hayes learned the hard way today that racism has no place in the skies or anywhere else. Huge respect to Marcus and Evelyn Carter for not backing down. #Carter's Prejudice. By the time Marcus boarded his connecting flight, he was already receiving calls and emails from media outlets requesting interviews. He knew that the incident had struck a nerve, tapping into a broader conversation about systemic racism and the power of accountability. As he settled into his seat, Marcus took a moment to gather his thoughts. He had no intention of turning this into a media spectacle, but he also understood the importance of seizing the moment to drive meaningful change. He began drafting a statement, one that would acknowledge the gravity of what had happened, while outlining the steps the airline would take to prevent future incidents. On Evelyn's flight, the ripple effects of the incident continued to unfold. Claire, the woman sitting across the aisle, struck up a conversation with another passenger, a middle-aged man in a business suit. "I just can't believe what happened at the gate," Claire said, shaking her head. "It's 2025. And we're still dealing with this kind of ignorance." The man nodded, his expression serious. "It's infuriating," he agreed. "But seeing how Evelyn and her husband handled it, that gives me hope." Claire smiled. "It's people like them who remind us that we can't afford to stay silent. If they hadn't spoken up, who knows how many more people would have been treated the same way." Their conversation caught the attention of a flight attendant passing by. She paused, her tray balanced expertly in one hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quiet but earnest. "I couldn't help overhearing. I just want to say that what happened to Mrs. Carter was unacceptable. As a crew member, it's my responsibility to ensure every passenger feels safe and respected, and I promise we're taking steps to make sure this doesn't happen again." Claire and the businessman exchanged glances, both nodding in agreement. "Thank you for saying that," Claire said. "It's good to know that some people take this seriously." The flight attendant smiled faintly. "We have to. If we don't, nothing will change." By the time the plane touched down at Evelyn's destination, the story of Gate 14 had already reached national headlines. News outlets were running segments on the incident, analyzing the broader implications and inviting experts to discuss systemic bias in the airline industry. Evelyn stepped off the plane with a renewed sense of purpose. As she walked through the terminal, she noticed people looking at her, their faces filled with recognition. Some approached her hesitantly, offering words of support or quiet gratitude. Others simply nodded, their expressions conveying a silent solidarity. One young woman, likely in her early 20s, stopped Evelyn near the baggage claim area. "Mrs. Carter," she said nervously, "I just wanted to say thank you. Seeing you stand up to that pilot, it made me realize I can stand up too." Evelyn placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. "Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong," she said. "You have as much right to be here as anyone else." The young woman smiled, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered before walking away. As Evelyn waited for her luggage, she took a moment to reflect. Today had been exhausting, but it had also been a turning point. She knew the fight for equality was far from over, but she felt a renewed determination to be part of the solution. This wasn't just her story. It was the story of everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. And as Evelyn walked out of the airport into the crisp evening air, she vowed to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for all those who couldn't. Repercussions and reaffirmation. The days following the incident at Gate 14 were a blur of media attention, corporate meetings, and personal reflection for both Evelyn and Marcus. Despite the whirlwind, Evelyn found herself feeling a sense of catharsis. What had started as a personal confrontation with a man's deeply ingrained biases had become a catalyst for change. a moment in time that could alter the course of how discrimination was handled in the aviation industry. In the days that followed, Marcus had kept his word. The airline had swiftly issued a public apology and a statement about their new, expanded diversity initiatives. A task force was set up to evaluate training programs, and a review of the airline's hiring practices was underway. A formal public apology was made by the airline CEO, and the airline promised to implement both immediate and long-term strategies to ensure that an incident like this would never happen again. The media coverage was relentless, but it was not the sensationalized kind that usually followed scandals. Instead, there was a focus on the courage of Evelyn and Marcus, and how their quiet determination had not only stopped a harmful act, but also sparked meaningful change. As the days went on, more stories came to light. Stories of passengers who had been quietly affected by Captain Hayes' actions. Passengers who had been too intimidated to speak up. One such story came from a woman named Rosa, a single mother who had been traveling with her young daughter. Rosa had been at Gate 14 that day, and though she had stayed in the background during the confrontation, the injustice had struck her deeply. She wrote a post on social media about her experience. "I was sitting there, watching what happened to Mrs. Carter, and I felt my heart break. I've been in that position too many times, the feeling of being looked down on, like you don't belong. But Mrs. Carter, she didn't flinch, and neither did her husband. They stood up, not just for themselves, but for every person who's ever been made to feel like they didn't matter. I'm proud to be a passenger with an airline that values its people." Rosa's post went viral, and it led to hundreds of others sharing their own experiences. Passengers from all walks of life, from every race and background, expressing their solidarity with Evelyn and Marcus. It was clear that the incident at Gate 14 had opened a larger conversation, one that would continue to echo throughout the industry and beyond. As the week progressed, Marcus met with several key stakeholders, including the board members of the airline. His tone was calm and measured, but there was an unmistakable sense of urgency in his voice. He knew this was the beginning of a much bigger movement. He wasn't content with just one gesture or one statement of apology. He wanted to change the foundation on which the airline was built. "Today, we're not just responding to one man's mistake," Marcus said during one meeting. "We're setting a new standard. We're telling our passengers, our employees, and the world that we won't tolerate prejudice in any form. We'll do more than offer apologies. We'll be proactive." It's time for the airline industry as a whole to recognize that diversity isn't just about meeting quotas. It's about creating an environment where everyone, regardless of their background, feels truly welcomed. One of the board members, an older man with a distinguished appearance, nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice deep and steady. "But it's going to take time. We've seen these issues addressed before, but often they don't lead to lasting change." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, his hands resting on the table as he leaned forward. "That's why I'm here. We'll implement new policies, of course, but we'll also monitor and hold ourselves accountable. This is the start of something bigger. We can't just make one change. We need a culture shift." The board member raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting that we overhaul how we operate, how we hire, train, and assess performance?" Marcus smiled. "Exactly. It starts with our leadership. We need to set the example for the rest of the industry. If we do this right, we won't just be another airline. We'll be a company that stands as a beacon of progress." Meanwhile, Evelyn found herself grappling with a different side of the experience, the emotional and psychological toll it had taken on her. The confrontation at Gate 14 had been so intense, so public, that it felt like she had relived the battle again and again in her mind. The support from Marcus, from the passengers, and from the online community had helped, but there was still the lingering question: why did it have to happen at all? She spent hours on the phone with her best friend, Camille, a fellow advocate for social justice who had always supported her, whether in her professional life or personal battles. Camille had known Evelyn's heart for activism long before Marcus came into the picture, and she was there, always, when Evelyn needed to speak her mind. "I think it's time to take a deeper dive into what this moment really means for you," Camille said thoughtfully one evening. "You've spoken out, you've challenged the system, and now you're getting all this attention. But the question I keep hearing from you is, what now?" Evelyn paused, considering her friend's words. "What now?" she echoed softly. "I'm not sure. On one hand, it feels like a victory. The airline is taking action. There's a shift happening. But on the other hand, I still wonder why we're still fighting this fight. Why does someone like Captain Hayes still have that kind of power?" Camille's voice was gentle but firm. "It's exhausting, I know. But think about the bigger picture. You've exposed something that a lot of people didn't want to see. They didn't want to see how deeply rooted this kind of discrimination is. They didn't want to face the truth. But you and Marcus, you're making them face it. And that's where the real change begins." Evelyn sighed. "I know. It's just hard to see the change when you're in the middle of it." Camille laughed softly. "That's true. But change doesn't happen overnight. It happens bit by bit, moment by moment. And you've made your mark." As the weeks went by, the ripple effect of Evelyn and Marcus's actions continued to grow. Marcus's leadership in the aftermath of the incident was praised by other business leaders, and the airline began to be seen as a pioneer in efforts toward diversity and inclusion. The company's HR department reported an increase in applications from underrepresented communities, signaling that the airline was finally becoming a place where people felt they could thrive. The airline also released a new initiative called Fly with Pride, a public-facing campaign that emphasized inclusivity in every facet of the business, from hiring practices to customer service. The program was designed to not only embrace diversity, but to actively promote it, creating a workplace that was reflective of the broader world in which the company operated. But despite the whirlwind of progress, Evelyn knew that this was just the beginning. She continued to speak at conferences, using her platform to advocate for systemic change. As the world shifted, so did she, constantly refining her approach, understanding that the fight for equality would never truly be over. But with every victory, no matter how small, Evelyn found renewed strength. She would never stop pushing for justice, not just for herself, but for the countless others who didn't yet have a voice. The fight at Gate 14 had sparked something that could not be extinguished, and Evelyn would carry it forward for as long as it took. The legacy of Gate 14. 6 months had passed since the incident at Gate 14, and the world seemed like a different place, not because everything had changed overnight, but because the ripple effects of that moment were still spreading, touching lives in ways Evelyn and Marcus Carter couldn't have imagined. Evelyn sat in a sunlit conference room in downtown Chicago, preparing to deliver the keynote speech at a diversity and inclusion summit. Organized by several Fortune 500 companies, the event had brought together leaders, activists, and changemakers from various industries to discuss the ongoing challenges of combating systemic discrimination. She adjusted the microphone on the podium, her calm demeanor masking the anticipation bubbling within her. The room was packed with hundreds of attendees, their faces a mixture of curiosity and respect. Evelyn had become something of a symbol, a quiet yet powerful force in the fight for equity. But she didn't see herself as a symbol. She was simply a woman who had stood her ground. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn began. 6 months ago, I found myself at Gate 14, standing in the face of prejudice. It wasn't the first time I'd encountered discrimination, and I'm certain it won't be the last. But that moment was different because it wasn't just about me. It was about every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. She paused, letting her words settle in the air. The truth is, the fight against systemic bias isn't easy. It's not glamorous. It's exhausting. But it's necessary. And every step forward, every conversation, every policy change, every act of courage matters. As she spoke, Evelyn's voice grew steadier, her words resonating deeply with the audience. She shared the lessons she had learned, not just from Gate 14, but from a lifetime of navigating spaces that weren't always welcoming. She spoke about resilience, about finding strength in community, and about the importance of holding institutions accountable. When she finished, the room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. Evelyn smiled, grateful but also aware of the weight of responsibility that came with the platform she now occupied. This was only the beginning. While Evelyn's speech was making waves in Chicago, Marcus was in New York, attending a meeting with leaders from other major airlines. The incident at Gate 14 had prompted not just internal changes within his company, but also a broader industry-wide reckoning. Airlines that had once resisted addressing issues of bias were now scrambling to implement new policies and training programs. The meeting room was filled with CEOs, HR executives, and legal advisors. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his commanding presence impossible to ignore. Over the past 6 months, he had become a central figure in the conversation about diversity in the airline industry, a role he embraced not out of ego, but out of necessity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his deep voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived the issues they were discussing. "We're here today because we all recognize that what happened at Gate 14 wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that affects every airline represented in this room." He paused, scanning the faces around the table. "Our passengers trust us to provide not just safe transportation, but also a safe environment, one where they feel respected and valued. That trust is a privilege, and it's one we've all taken for granted for far too long." The room was silent as Marcus outlined a series of proposals, including the establishment of an independent oversight body to handle complaints of discrimination, the implementation of standardized anti-bias training across all airlines, and the creation of a passenger bill of rights that explicitly prohibited discriminatory treatment. "These changes won't be easy," Marcus admitted, "and they won't happen overnight. But if we're serious about earning back the trust of our passengers, we have to start here. We have to start now." By the end of the meeting, the group had agreed to form a coalition dedicated to advancing equity in the airline industry. Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment, but he also knew this was just the first step. The real work lay ahead. Back in Chicago, Evelyn returned to her hotel room after the summit, exhausted but fulfilled. She had spent hours answering questions, meeting with activists, and brainstorming solutions with corporate leaders. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "The coalition is happening. We're making progress." She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Marcus's determination was unwavering, and together, they were proving that change was possible, even in an industry as entrenched in tradition as aviation. That evening, Evelyn sat by the window of her hotel room, looking out at the city skyline. She thought about the young woman who had approached her after the Gate 14 incident, the one who had said Evelyn's courage inspired her. She thought about Rosa, the single mother who had shared her story online. She thought about all the people who had reached out, some to thank her, others to share their own experiences of discrimination. Each story reminded her why this work mattered. Months turned into a year, and the changes set in motion by Gate 14 continued to grow. The airline's Fly with Pride campaign became a model for other companies, earning accolades for its authenticity and impact. The coalition Marcus had spearheaded released its first annual report, detailing the progress made across the industry and outlining goals for the future. But for Evelyn, the most rewarding moments were the personal ones, the letters, emails, and messages from people whose lives had been touched by her story. A teacher in Atlanta wrote to say she had used the Gate 14 incident to teach her students about standing up to injustice. A father in Seattle shared how he had used Evelyn's example to teach his daughters about self-respect and resilience. One evening, as Evelyn and Marcus sat on their back porch, watching the sun set over their garden, Evelyn turned to her husband. "Do you ever think about how one moment, one decision, can change everything?" Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "All the time," he said. "Gate 14 wasn't just about us. It was about everyone who saw what happened and decided they wouldn't stay silent anymore." And it was about us deciding that we wouldn't let it break us. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder, a sense of peace washing over her. I think we did the right thing, she said softly. Marcus placed his hand over hers. We didn't just do the right thing, he replied. We started something bigger than ourselves, and we're not done yet. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of purpose. Gate 14 had been a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a legacy, one built on courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief that justice was always worth fighting for. The full circle. Evelyn and Marcus sat in the soft glow of their porch light, reflecting on how far they had come. Their fight at Gate 14 had sparked ripples, touching countless lives and igniting change in ways they hadn't imagined. Yet both knew the road ahead wasn't without challenges. Evelyn broke the silence, her voice steady. You know, Marcus, it's not just about what we've done. It's about what others do after us. The change we've started is only as strong as the people who carry it forward. Marcus nodded, his hand tightening around hers. And they will. You've inspired so many people, Evelyn. We've inspired them. That's how movements are built, one voice at a time. Their conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of Evelyn's phone. She glanced at the screen and saw an email from the airline. Opening it, she read aloud. Subject: Recognition of Courage and Leadership. Dear Mrs. Carter, in the wake of the changes inspired by the events at Gate 14, the airline board would like to formally recognize your courage and leadership. We are honored to invite you to join our Diversity and Equity Advisory Panel, where your insights and experiences will help shape the future of this company. We believe that your voice is invaluable in ensuring that the progress we've made continues to grow. Thank you for reminding us of the power of standing up for what is right. Sincerely, Margaret Hensley, CEO, Skyview Airlines. Evelyn lowered the phone, her eyes wide. They want me on the advisory panel, she said, her voice tinged with both surprise and pride. Marcus grinned. Of course they do. Who better to guide them than the woman who challenged them to be better? Evelyn felt a swell of emotion, but quickly steadied herself. If I'm going to do this, Marcus, it can't just be a ceremonial position. I want real power to make decisions, real opportunities to hold people accountable. And you'll have it, Marcus said confidently. They wouldn't dare offer you anything less after what happened. Evelyn exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of this new responsibility settle on her shoulders. But instead of fear, she felt determination. She looked at Marcus, her partner in every sense of the word, and smiled. Then I'll do it. 1 year later, the changes sparked by the Gate 14 incident were undeniable. Skyview Airlines had implemented sweeping reforms, becoming a leader in diversity and inclusion within the airline industry. The coalition Marcus had formed had expanded to include airlines from around the world, creating a global network of companies committed to equity and accountability. Evelyn's role on the Diversity and Equity Advisory Panel had become central to the airline's transformation. She worked closely with executives and employees, ensuring that the new policies were more than just words on paper. Under her guidance, the airline introduced initiatives that included mentorship programs for underrepresented groups, increased transparency in hiring and promotions, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. But the most meaningful part of Evelyn's work wasn't in boardrooms or at conferences. It was in the letters and messages she continued to receive from people around the world. Passengers, employees, and even strangers who had been inspired by her story. One letter, in particular, stayed with her. It was from a young woman named Aisha, who worked as a flight attendant at another airline. Dear Mrs. Carter, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. I've always loved working in aviation, but I used to feel invisible, like I had to work twice as hard just to be noticed. After the changes you helped bring about, things are different. People like me are finally being seen, being heard. I don't know if I'll ever get the chance to thank you in person, but I hope you know how much you've inspired me. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for all of us. With gratitude, Aisha. Evelyn read the letter aloud to Marcus one evening, her voice breaking with emotion. "This," she said, wiping away a tear, "is why we did it." Marcus leaned over and kissed her forehead. "And this is why we'll keep doing it." The final chapter. On the anniversary of the Gate 14 incident, Skyview Airlines held a special ceremony at their headquarters. The event was attended by employees, passengers, and community leaders, all of whom had been touched by the changes the Carters had inspired. Evelyn and Marcus were the guests of honor, their names now synonymous with resilience and justice. As Evelyn took the stage to speak, she looked out at the audience, her heart full. She thought of the countless moments that had led her here, the pain, the struggle, the triumphs. And as she spoke, her voice was steady and resolute. "We've come a long way since that day at Gate 14, she began. "But our journey is far from over. Change isn't a destination. It's a process. It's something we work toward every day, in every decision we make." She paused, letting her words settle in the room. "I stand here today not just as a survivor of discrimination, but as a witness to the power of standing together. To everyone who has supported us, who has shared their own stories, who has dared to speak out, I thank you. And I challenge you to keep going. Keep pushing. Keep fighting for the world we all deserve." The applause that followed was thunderous, a testament to the impact Evelyn and Marcus had made. As the ceremony concluded, Evelyn and Marcus stood together, their hands clasped, their hearts full. Gate 14 had been the beginning of something extraordinary, a moment that reminded the world that justice, no matter how hard won, was always worth fighting for. Together, they had turned a moment of pain into a legacy of progress, and as they looked toward the future, they knew their work was far from finished. The journey continued, but they would walk it together, side by side.